There is a jungle in the Philippines that kept a secret for 29 years. Not a small secret, not the kind that fades quietly into the dark. This was the kind of secret that consumed a man's entire life, stole it, stretched it, twisted it into something no dictionary in any language has a word for. The kind that makes you stop and ask, quietly, what is loyalty really? And what happens to a man when loyalty becomes the only thing left? His name was Hiroo Onoda. And in 1974, when the world had already buried the memory of World War II beneath 3 decades of rebuilding and reinvention, this man was still in the jungle, still in uniform, still believing, still fighting. Not for victory, not even for survival, for duty. To understand Hiroo Onoda, you have to understand the Japan he was born into. Not the Japan of bullet trains and neon skylines, but the Japan of 1922. Ancient, disciplined, proud in a way that modern language struggles to carry. A Japan where the emperor was not a figurehead, but a living god. Where the military was not a career, but a calling. Where surrender was not simply defeat, it was spiritual erasure, the annihilation of the self. These values were not something Hiroo Onoda chose the way a man chooses a coat. They were built into the architecture of who he was, brick by brick, year by year, through every lesson, every ceremony, every story passed down through a culture that believed there was no greater act than dying in service to your nation. He was 20 years old when Japan went to war with the world. He was 22 when the army came for him. He trained. He became what the Japanese military called the guerrilla warfare specialist. Not a frontline soldier who charges across open ground, but a shadow, a ghost. A man trained to disappear into terrain and keep fighting long after conventional forces had moved on. He was built for one specific purpose: survive alone, trust your orders above all other information, and never, under any circumstances, believe enemy propaganda. That last instruction would become the most consequential sentence of his entire life. In December of 1944, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda landed on Lubang Island in the Philippines. He was 22 years old. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, looked him in the eyes before departure and gave him words that Onoda would carry for 3 decades like a stone in his chest. You will continue to fight, no matter what you hear, no matter what anyone tells you. You will fight until you receive official orders from me personally to stop. Onoda nodded. He went into the jungle, and the world moved on without him. August 15th, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across radio speakers across Japan and the Pacific. It was the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their emperor speak. The voice was thin, formal, and it carried words that no Japanese person had ever imagined hearing. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The devastation that followed was not simply grief, it was existential collapse. Soldiers wept. Officers took their own lives. The war they had believed in completely, bled for absolutely, died for without hesitation, was finished. On Lubang Island, there was no radio for Hiroo Onoda. There was only jungle. Dense, indifferent, green jungle. The hum of insects, the heavy wet heat of tropical air, his small band of remaining soldiers, 3 men, and the silence that comes when you are very far from the rest of the human world. They did not know. When the leaflets came, dropped from aircraft, drifting down through the canopy like strange white leaves, Onoda picked them up and read them carefully. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. Come out, lay down your weapons. He read the words. He looked at his men. This is enemy propaganda. It was not an irrational conclusion. He had been trained specifically to expect this, to expect fabricated documents, false information, psychological manipulation designed to make Japanese soldiers abandon their posts. Everything about his training told him this was exactly what an enemy trying to break a guerrilla unit would do. And Major Taniguchi had told him personally, trust only orders that come from me. No order had come from Major Taniguchi. So Onoda folded the leaflet, set it aside, and went back to the jungle. The years that followed are difficult to hold in the mind all at once because they are so enormous, so heavy, so completely outside the frame of anything most human beings will ever experience. Japan rebuilt itself out of ash and grief and the unimaginable weight of defeat. The Japanese people constructed something extraordinary, a new economy, a new identity, a new place in the world. The country that had waged the most catastrophic war in Asian history became within a generation one of the most prosperous and sophisticated nations on the planet. Life, remarkable, relentless life, moved forward. On Lubang Island, Hiroo Onoda did not move forward. He moved through the jungle. He maintained his rifle with extraordinary discipline, cleaning it constantly against the humidity that would otherwise destroy it. He foraged. He raided local farms for food when necessary. These raids sometimes turned violent. Filipino civilians and soldiers who encountered what they believed was a band of dangerous criminal holdouts. Onoda believed he was engaged in guerrilla warfare against enemy forces. The reality, which he could not see, was that he was a ghost from a finished war haunting a world that had already made peace. His men began to leave him. Yuichi Akatsu surrendered to Filipino authorities in 1950. 5 years after the war ended, he simply walked out of the jungle. Onoda watched him go and did not follow. In his framework, Akatsu's choice was desertion, nothing less. Shoichi Shimada was killed in 1954 during a clash with a Filipino search party. Onoda buried him in the jungle without ceremony, without the right words, without anything a death deserves. You bury your dead as best you can, and you keep moving. Search parties came from Japan. The government knew stragglers remained scattered across the Pacific and sent teams to find them. Families of Onoda's men traveled to the island and called out through the trees, using voices and names only their loved ones would recognize, begging them to come home. Onoda heard these voices. He believed they were tricks. He could not allow himself to believe otherwise. Because if the leaflets were real, if the voices were real, if the war was truly over, then everything he had endured in these years, every act of violence, every sacrifice, none of it meant anything. It would collapse into an enormous, unbearable nothing. The mind protects itself. Onoda's mind chose the jungle over the truth. 1972. 27 years after the war ended. Onoda and his last remaining companion, Kinshichi Kazuka, were ambushed by Filipino police while destroying stored rice. In the firefight, Kazuka was shot and killed. Onoda was alone, truly alone, for the first time in all those years. No voice beside him in the darkness, no companion to share the slow weight of the days. Just him and the jungle and a war that now existed only inside his own mind. He was 50 years old. He had entered this jungle as a 22-year-old soldier with his whole life ahead of him. Now, he was a middle-aged man, lean and weathered, and extraordinary in a way that almost no language can adequately describe. Living in complete isolation in terrain that had consumed nearly 3 decades of his existence, he kept fighting because he did not know how to do anything else. In 1974, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki told anyone who would listen that he was going to find Hiroo Onoda. He was 23 years old, full of energy, and something close to beautiful recklessness. Every official search party, every government mission, every organized effort had failed to make contact. Suzuki did not care about any of that. He found Hiroo Onoda in 4 days. He walked into the part of the jungle where locals said strange things sometimes happened, made camp, waited. And Onoda, this ghost, who had spent 30 years watching and surviving, observed this young man long enough to decide he was not a threat and came out. They spoke. For the first time in all those years, Hiroo Onoda sat with someone from the outside world and had a real conversation. Suzuki told him the war was over. Onoda listened carefully and then gave his answer with complete calm. He needed official orders from Major Taniguchi in person. Only that would be sufficient. Suzuki went back to Japan. He found Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, now retired, working quietly as a bookseller. The war, a distant chapter in a long life that had moved on. Suzuki explained what he had found in the jungle. Taniguchi listened, and then this old man, who had sent a young soldier into the jungle with orders that were never meant to last 30 years, got on a plane. March 9th, 1974. Major Taniguchi walked into the jungle on Lubang Island and found Hiroo Onoda exactly where Suzuki had left him. Onoda was in his uniform. His rifle was clean and fully functional. He stood at attention with the posture of a soldier who had never once allowed himself to forget what he was. Taniguchi stood before him. He read the official orders aloud. Japan had surrendered on August 15th, 1945. All combat activity was to cease immediately. Hiroo Onoda was officially relieved of his duty. There is a photograph taken in the moments that followed that has become one of the most quietly devastating images in the historical record of the 20th century. It shows Hiroo Onoda, 52 years old, thin, deeply weathered, handing over his rifle. His face carries something that no single word is large enough to contain. It is the face of a man whose world just ended. Not the world of war, the world of purpose, the world of absolute clarity, where every single day had meaning because every single day was in service to something larger than the self. That world ended on March 9th, 1974, when a retired bookseller in an old uniform read official words in a Philippine jungle clearing. Onoda wept. Not loudly, not dramatically, but he wept. A man of extraordinary self-control who had survived alone through sheer force of will for 30 years, weeping quietly in the moment his war finally, irrevocably ended. He surrendered formally to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, who pardoned him completely. Marcos understood, as did most who watched this story unfold, that this man had not been a criminal. He had been a soldier who was simply never told the battle was over. Japan received him as a hero. The streets of Tokyo gave him something close to awe. Here was a man who embodied, in his very existence, something the Japanese cultural soul had always believed in, but rarely seen so completely realized. Absolute loyalty. Not convenient loyalty, not loyalty until it became difficult, or clearly pointless. Loyalty that had no exit clause. Loyalty that continued in complete darkness and complete silence for 29 years without a single witness to affirm it. He never apologized for the years in the jungle. He was asked many times whether he regretted it, whether the lost decades filled him with grief. His answer was always essentially the same. He had followed his orders. He had done his duty. He could not have done otherwise and remained who he was. The regret, if there was any, was not for the choice to stay. It was for the specific people hurt, the lives that crossed his own in that jungle and did not walk away unharmed, that he carried quietly. The decades themselves he did not regret. He was not a man who wanted your pity. He was a man who wanted you to understand. Onoda did not settle easily into the Japan he returned to. The country that greeted him was unrecognizable. The values he had grown up inside, the total spiritual militarism that had shaped his identity, had been deliberately and thoroughly dismantled in his absence. Modern Japan disturbed him. He said so publicly. He was troubled by what he saw as a generation that had not been asked to sacrifice anything and did not understand what sacrifice meant. He moved to Brazil, established a cattle ranch in the countryside, built something with his hands in a place where the horizons were enormous and the silence was deep. He married. He lived a life that was physical and purposeful and suited him in ways that a Japanese city never quite would. He wrote a book, No Surrender, My 30-Year War. In its pages, he did not position himself as a victim. He did not ask for sympathy. He tried to explain, with extraordinary honesty, what those years had actually been like from the inside. The daily decisions, the slow management of fear and doubt and loneliness, the ongoing work of keeping himself functional and purposeful when the easiest thing in the world would have been to simply stop. He eventually returned to Japan and in his later years established a nature school in the mountains of Fukushima because he believed that young people needed difficulty. They needed to learn to endure, to sit with discomfort, to develop the interior resources that modern comfort actively worked against. He died on January 16, 2013. He was 91 years old. The soldier who fought the longest war in history, alone, in a jungle, against an enemy that had already signed the peace, lived to be an old man. The Emperor of Japan sent a message of condolence. Here is what stays with you when you sit long enough with the story of Hiroo Onoda. It is not the 30 years, although 30 years is staggering. A man spending his entire adult life, from his early 20s to his early 50s, doing one single thing, because he believed with complete sincerity that it was right and required of him. What stays with you is the question his story asks without ever quite stating it directly. What is loyalty worth when the thing you are loyal to no longer exists? Onoda was loyal to Japan, but the Japan he was loyal to, the Japan of the emperor as living god, of military honor as the highest human value, ceased to exist in August of 1945. The Japan that greeted him in 1974 was in almost every meaningful sense a completely different country. He had been loyal to a ghost. And yet, there is something in the human heart that cannot fully condemn him for it. Something that understands, below argument and logic and historical perspective, what it means to make a promise and keep it. What it means to be given a duty and refuse to abandon it, even when abandonment would be the rational, survivable, reasonable choice. Most of us live inside comfortable structures where our commitments are regularly renegotiated, and our obligations have exit clauses built in, and our loyalty is always somewhere in the background, conditional on things continuing to make sense. Onoda had no exit clause. He had orders. He had a jungle. He had a rifle he kept clean for 30 years. And he had a belief, absolute, unshakable, wrong in its specific facts, but strangely coherent in its moral architecture, that his duty was real and required everything he had. He gave it everything he had, alone. The jungle did not break him. Time did not break him. Loneliness did not break him. Only an old man reading official words in a jungle clearing could end what the entire world could not. Because Hiroo Onoda was never really fighting the enemy, he was fighting for meaning. And the most quietly devastating thing about that is not that he was wrong. It is that most of us will never fight for anything that completely, for anything at all.